Welcome to Boring Boris, History for Sleep. Read calmly by Boris. Tonight we will take a slow journey into a side of ancient Egypt that most history books leave in the shadows. You already know about pyramids, pharaohs, and golden tombs. But did you know that the most powerful beings in Egypt were not always kings or gods in human form? Sometimes they were animals. The Egyptians mummified millions of creatures: cats, crocodiles, ibises, even bulls. These were not pets placed lovingly in tombs. They were sacred beings, raised and buried as offerings, as living vessels of divine power. Imagine whole cities where cats were honored above people, where a single bull could become the center of national worship, or where the cry of an ibis was heard as the voice of wisdom itself. Tonight we will uncover why animals mattered so deeply. We will look at how these cults shaped daily life, guided law and ritual, and even reached into the afterlife. This is not a story of curiosity or superstition. It is a story of a civilization that built its world on a bond between humans, animals, and the divine. So settle in and let us begin. When we think of ancient Egypt, most of us picture the golden mask of Tutankhamun, the towering pyramids at Giza, or the sweeping Nile cutting through the desert. Yet hidden beneath these iconic images lies another world, one that is harder for us to grasp. It is a world where animals were not only part of nature but part of the sacred order itself. Few discoveries capture this more vividly than the strange case of a crocodile mummy discovered in the early 20th century. Inside this massive creature, carefully wrapped and preserved, archaeologists found the tiny mummified bodies of dozens of baby crocodiles, a mother carrying her children into eternity. Or perhaps something more symbolic, something that tells us how Egyptians understood life, death, and the divine. To a modern eye this might seem macabre, even grotesque. Why would a society go to the trouble of preparing such a display? The answer lies in the way Egyptians perceived animals. The crocodile was not just a dangerous predator lurking in the Nile. It was the embodiment of Sobek, the crocodile god of strength, fertility, and protection. To mummify a crocodile was not to honor the animal itself, but to create a direct connection to Sobek's divine power. By adding the baby crocodiles, the priests transformed this offering into something greater. It was not only a single gesture of reverence, but a symbol of fertility, abundance, and renewal. The Great Mother carried her offspring, just as Sobek carried life and death within his jaws. The story of this mummy forces us to challenge our assumptions. When we hear about animal cults, it is easy to dismiss them as primitive or eccentric. But in truth, the Egyptians were not worshipping animals as gods. They were venerating animals as living mirrors of cosmic forces. The crocodile was not Sobek himself, but it reflected Sobek's qualities. To see a crocodile basking on the riverbank was to glimpse the divine made visible in the natural world. That is why the body of the crocodile, once preserved, became a channel for offerings and prayers. Imagine the rituals that surrounded such a mummy. Pilgrims may have traveled miles to see it, to touch the wrappings, to whisper a prayer before it. The temple priests, charged with maintaining these sacred relics, would have carefully tended the embalming process. Oils, resins, linen bandages, and ritual incantations all combined to transform a simple corpse into a sacred object. Once finished, the crocodile would be placed in a catacomb with thousands of others, forming a vast subterranean archive of devotion. The practical effort was immense. Crocodiles had to be captured, raised, and sometimes even bred for the purpose of mummification. Artisans specialized in wrapping and preserving them. Farmers and fishermen contributed offerings to the temples. An entire economy of faith revolved around Sobek and his sacred beasts. The crocodile mummy with its brood of young was not an isolated curiosity. It was part of a massive and organized system of religious practice that linked common villages with the highest priestly rituals. This is where we begin to see why animals mattered so much. They were not random symbols chosen without thought. Each one embodied specific qualities that Egyptians believed were essential to the balance of the cosmos. The crocodile carried both fear and protection. To fear it was natural, but to honor it was wise. By respecting Sobek, the people hoped to ensure fertility for their fields, safety on the Nile, and strength in times of war. In this light, the strange mummy ceases to be a curiosity and becomes a lesson. It shows how the Egyptians wove together the natural and the divine, how they saw continuity between human society and the wider world. The crocodile that terrified them could also protect them. The same jaws that destroyed could also give life. By honoring the crocodile, they acknowledged that power is always double-edged, always capable of both harm and good. The case of the crocodile within a crocodile also prepares us for the broader journey ahead. We will see bulls chosen as oracles, cats elevated as guardians of households, ibises seen as voices of wisdom, and lions feared as bringers of plague and healing alike. Each story reminds us that in Egypt, animals were never just animals. They were bridges between the human and the divine, reminders that life itself is fragile, sacred, and bound to forces greater than our own. When we speak about the animal cults of ancient Egypt, one of the most common misconceptions is that Egyptians simply worshipped animals as gods. It is an easy assumption to make, especially when we see endless statues of cats, bulls, or falcons in museums. But this belief misses the deeper truth. For the Egyptians, animals were never gods in themselves. They were vessels, living mirrors that reflected a divine essence. To mistake the vessel for the god was to misunderstand the entire system of thought. The Egyptians lived in a world where the divine was everywhere. The Nile's flood was not only a natural event, it was the work of Hapi, the river god. The blazing sun was Ra's daily journey across the sky. The sky itself was the body of the goddess Nut, arched overhead. In this worldview, the sacred did not stand apart from the natural world. It was present in it, shaping it, giving it meaning. Animals became one of the clearest ways for the Egyptians to see this divine presence. Take the falcon. To us it is a bird of prey, sharp-eyed and swift. To the Egyptians it was the reflection of Horus, the sky god, ruler of kingship. When a falcon soared above the desert cliffs, Egyptians saw more than wings and feathers. They saw the majesty and protection of Horus embodied in flight. In the same way, the bull's strength embodied Ibis, the ibis's calm precision embodied Thoth, and the cat's grace embodied Bastet. The animal was a reminder, a living image of qualities that defined divine power. This distinction mattered greatly. The priests themselves warned against the idea that animals were gods. They were careful to explain that the gods were far beyond human or animal form. The animal body was a temporary reflection, a mask through which divine force could be glimpsed. A statue, an amulet, a temple carving, and a living creature all operated in the same way. They were mediums. They allowed human beings to encounter the divine through a shape they could understand. The Egyptians also believed that not every animal of a species was sacred. A particular bull could be chosen as the Apis bull because certain markings showed it to be the chosen vessel of Ptah. Not every falcon was Horus, but one falcon in the temple might serve as his living image. Not every cat was Bastet, but in the temple of Bubastis, certain cats were treated as sacred incarnations. This selectiveness shows us how organized and careful the system was. It was not blind worship of all creatures, but recognition of specific vessels of divine energy. Consider the rituals that surrounded these vessels. When the sacred bull died, the priests mourned it as if a king had fallen. The body was embalmed, buried in massive sarcophagi, and honored with festivals. Yet the priests also searched immediately for the next bull, marked with sacred signs. Because the god had not died, the vessel had ended, but the divine essence remained. In this cycle we see the Egyptian view of continuity. Life and death were not opposites but transitions, and the divine moved fluidly through the natural world. This perspective also shaped daily devotion. Ordinary Egyptians might not see the gods directly, but they could see animals. To encounter a cat in the street or a falcon above the fields was to be reminded that the divine was close. The presence of animals created a sense of constant nearness to powers beyond human reach. People prayed to them, left offerings, and even shaped their lives around the rhythms of these sacred creatures. It is important for us to pause and reflect on how different this worldview is from our own. Today we tend to separate the sacred from the natural. We place religion in temples or churches, and we place nature in forests or rivers. For the Egyptians, there was no such division. The divine was not hidden away. It was seen in every movement of the Nile, every sunrise, every living creature that walked the earth. To honor animals as vessels of divine power was to honor the truth that life itself is sacred. By understanding this, we can see why the Egyptians were so committed to their animal cults. They were not practicing eccentric superstition. They were expressing a profound philosophy of interconnectedness. Animals, humans, and gods were part of one continuous reality. The vessel might change, but the essence remained. And this belief gave shape to their rituals, their laws, their art, and even their vision of the afterlife. If animals in ancient Egypt were not gods themselves, then what exactly were they? To answer this, we must think of them as mirrors. A mirror does not create an image. It reflects something already present. In the same way, the Egyptians believed that animals reflected divine qualities. When they looked at a lioness, they did not see a goddess in flesh and blood. They saw a living reflection of Sekhmet's ferocity, her power to destroy enemies and to heal plagues. When they looked at the steady, patient Ibis, they saw the calm wisdom of Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge. The animal did not invent the power, it mirrored it. This idea of reflection shaped Egyptian religion at every level. The gods themselves were often pictured with animal heads, not because Egyptians believed the gods looked like that, but because the animal face showed clearly what quality the god embodied. A falcon's sharp eyes showed watchfulness. A jackal's nose, always searching, showed the vigilance of Anubis over the dead. A cat's elegance and grace showed the protective but gentle side of Bastet. These images were teaching tools, visual mirrors of truths that could not easily be described in words. What is remarkable is how consistent these reflections were. Across centuries, Egyptians associated the same animals with the same divine powers. The bull always meant strength and fertility. The crocodile always meant both fear and protection. The scarab beetle always meant rebirth and transformation, rolling the sun across the sky just as it rolled its ball of earth. This consistency shows us that the Egyptians did not make casual choices. They observed animals closely, studied their behavior, and found in them patterns that echoed their deepest spiritual ideas. To us, this way of thinking may feel alien. Today we separate symbolic meaning from natural behavior. We say that a lion is strong, but we do not believe its strength has cosmic importance. The Egyptians did. To them, the behavior of animals was a message from the gods. The croak of a frog after the Nile flood was not only a sound of nature, it was a reminder of life returning. The hiss of a cobra was not only a warning, it was a sign of royal protection, the same serpent that appeared on the crowns of kings. The natural world was a mirror of the divine order, and animals were its clearest reflection. This belief also brought responsibility. If animals reflected divine qualities, then to harm one was not just an act of cruelty, it was an insult to the divine itself. Killing a sacred cat was seen as an unthinkable crime, one that could bring punishment on the entire community. Even the accidental killing of a sacred animal could lead to severe penalties. In this way, the mirror belief reinforced both social and moral order. Respecting animals meant respecting the gods. At the same time, the mirror could be double-edged. Just as animals reflected divine power, they also reminded Egyptians of the dangers of imbalance. A crocodile reflected Sobek's fertility, but it also reflected his rage. A lioness reflected Sekhmet's healing, but also her destructive fury. Animals showed both sides of divine force, nurturing and violent, protective and terrifying. By honoring animals, Egyptians admitted that the divine was never simple. It was complex, contradictory, and beyond human control. The idea of the divine mirror also touched daily life in subtle ways. Amulets carved in the shape of animals were worn not to honor the animal itself, but to carry a fragment of the divine quality it reflected. A scarab amulet promised renewal, a cat amulet promised protection, a falcon amulet promised clarity of vision. Each of these objects was a tiny mirror, a way for ordinary people to carry divine qualities close to them. We should not underestimate the philosophical depth here. By seeing animals as mirrors, Egyptians created a worldview where nothing was ordinary. Every creature was a signpost pointing to higher truths. To walk through a village or sail the Nile was to be surrounded by symbols, each reminding the observer of the invisible order of the cosmos. This constant reflection kept the sacred present in every moment of daily life. In the end, the mirror idea explains why animal cults lasted for millennia. They were not irrational superstitions clung to by a few. They were a coherent system of thought that tied together religion, morality, and nature. Animals were not gods, but they revealed the gods. They did not create divine power, but they showed it in a form people could see, touch, and understand. The Egyptians lived in a hall of mirrors, where every animal reflected the eternal truths of their world. By now it is clear that animals in ancient Egypt were not random symbols but vital reflections of divine qualities. Yet, there is another dimension to this story, one that reaches beyond temples and sacred rituals. Animals were not only mirrors of the gods, they were civic pillars. Their cults shaped the very structure of Egyptian society, binding together economy, politics, and daily life. To understand Egypt, we must understand how deeply animals stood at the heart of its civilization. The first way this appeared was through temples. Every major cult of an animal required not only priests but buildings, storage, workers, and funding. Entire temple complexes grew up around these cults, forming cities within cities. The Apis bull at Memphis was not simply kept in a small shrine. He lived in a grand temple complex where visitors from across Egypt came to pay their respects. These visits were not free. Pilgrims brought offerings, gifts, and payments. The temple became a financial center, supported by the devotion to a single sacred bull. The same was true at Bastet, where the cult of Bastet transformed the town into a thriving pilgrimage site. Her festivals, often described by Greek visitors as among the most joyful and crowded in Egypt, drew thousands of people. Boats full of singing and dancing worshippers traveled down the Nile to honor the goddess. Local markets thrived. Artisans sold amulets of cats, priests organized rituals, and innkeepers profited from the crowds. Bastet was not only a goddess of protection, she was the foundation of an economy. Another way animals became civic pillars was through law and order. Because certain creatures were sacred, the state had to enforce their protection. Killing or harming a cat or an ibis was not treated as a simple crime. It was a violation of the divine order. Records tell us of mobs that attacked entire households if someone was accused of harming a sacred animal. The state supported these reactions, knowing that the cults were not just private beliefs but the backbone of social stability. The fear of divine retribution was enough to keep entire towns in line. We can also see the political importance of animals in the way rulers aligned themselves with these cults. Pharaohs presented themselves as chosen by the gods, but they often used animals as proof of their connection. A king might be called the living Horus, associating himself with the falcon. Others linked themselves with strong bulls, presenting their reign as a time of fertility and power. By connecting themselves with sacred animals, rulers reinforced their legitimacy and bound the loyalty of the people through shared devotion. Animals also shaped civic life in quieter ways. In households, amulets of cats, scarabs, or cobras reinforced family identity. In villages, festivals tied communities together in celebration. In cities, murals and statues of animals reminded everyone of the divine presence. Even agriculture was tied to these beliefs. The fertility of the Nile and the protection of crops were thought to depend on honoring the right animal cults. To neglect the cult was to risk famine or plague. Civic responsibility was inseparable from animal devotion. What is striking is how efficient this system was. By investing animals with sacred power, the Egyptians created a network that connected belief with practical stability. Temples became banks, festivals became engines of commerce, laws became sacred duties, and rulers became divine figures. All of this flowed from the devotion to animal. The cults were not eccentric sideshows. They were central supports of the civic order. For us, this may seem unusual. We might ask how devotion to cats, crocodiles, or bulls could support an entire civilization. But for the Egyptians, this was perfectly natural. The animals were not random choices. Each represented qualities that held society together. Protection, fertility, wisdom, and strength were not abstract ideas. They were embodied in creatures that everyone could see and understand. By tying society to these reflections, the Egyptians ensured that every person, from farmer to pharaoh, shared in the same framework of meaning. In the end, animals as civic pillars reveal the genius of Egyptian religion. It was not only about the afterlife or the distant gods, it was about the living community. By honoring animals, Egyptians honored the values that bound them together. The cat reminded them to protect their homes. The bull reminded them of strength and prosperity. The ibis reminded them of knowledge. The crocodile reminded them of the power of the Nile. These reminders were not hidden in books or sermons. They walked, swam, and flew through daily life, ever present and undeniable. Among all the sacred animals of ancient Egypt, none held a higher place than the Apis bull. To the Egyptians, the bull was more than a symbol of strength and fertility. It was a living oracle, a creature chosen by the gods to reveal their will on earth. The cult of Apis, centered in the ancient city of Memphis, became one of the most powerful and enduring religious institutions in all of Egypt. To understand the depth of animal devotion, we must begin with this extraordinary beast. The Apis bull was not just any bull. Priests searched carefully for calves that carried certain sacred markings. Ancient sources tell us that the perfect Apis had a white triangle on its forehead, an eagle on its back, a scarab-shaped mark under its tongue, and a tail with double hairs. These signs were believed to show that the god Ptah, the great creator deity of Memphis, had chosen this animal as his earthly vessel. Once found, The bull was brought to the temple with great ceremony and installed in a special sanctuary, treated with reverence that rivaled a king's. Life for the Apis bull was unlike that of any other creature. He lived in luxury within the temple precincts, cared for by priests who fed him, bathed him, and led him in rituals. Ordinary Egyptians traveled long distances to glimpse the bull, believing that his presence brought fertility to the land and blessings to their families. To see him was to witness divine power in living form. His movements were even read as oracles. If he accepted food from a visitor's hand, it was a good omen. If he refused, it was a sign of misfortune. His very behavior was a language through which the gods spoke. The death of an Apis bull was a moment of immense importance. Unlike most animals, whose mummies were offerings, the Apis was treated with the same honor as royalty. His body was embalmed with exquisite care, wrapped in fine linen, and placed in a massive stone sarcophagus. These burials took place in the Serapeum at Saqqara, a vast underground complex of corridors lined with enormous granite tombs. To walk through this necropolis today is to feel the weight of reverence the Egyptians placed upon their sacred bull. Each sarcophagus, weighing many tons, was a monument to the power of a living vessel of the divine. After the death of one Apis bull, the priests immediately began searching for his successor. The divine essence did not die with the animal. It simply moved to another chosen vessel. In this cycle we see the Egyptian view of continuity. Life and death were transitions, not ends. The eternal presence of Ptah flowed from one bull to the next, ensuring that the people always had a living oracle in their midst. The cult of Apis was not limited to Memphis. Over time it became a unifying force across Egypt. Pharaohs aligned themselves with the bull, presenting themselves as protectors of his cult. Festivals honoring Apis drew pilgrims from across the land, and the offerings that poured into his temple made it one of the wealthiest religious centers in Egypt. The economic impact was enormous. Herds were raised to supply the temple. Artisans produced amulets and statues of bulls, and entire industries grew around the devotion to this single animal. Even foreign rulers recognized the importance of the Apis bull. When the Persians conquered Egypt, their kings made a point of honoring the bull to win local support. Later, during the Greek and Roman periods, the cult of Apis blended with the worship of Serapis, a new deity that combined Egyptian and Hellenistic elements. This fusion shows how powerful the Apis cult had become. It could not be ignored, even by outsiders. Instead, it was adapted and absorbed, proving its strength and resilience. What the Apis bull reveals is the seriousness of animal devotion in Egypt. This was not mere affection for a creature. It was a system of belief that bound together religion, politics, economy, and identity. The Apis bull was a civic symbol, a divine messenger, and a reminder of the eternal presence of the gods. His life and death were ceremonies that touched every level of society. When we reflect on this, the strangeness fades, and the logic becomes clear. To the Egyptians, the Apis bull was the ultimate vessel. His strength mirrored the fertility of the land. His presence reassured the people that the gods were near. His death and rebirth through a new bull reflected the eternal cycle of life, death, and renewal. Through him, the Egyptians found continuity in a world of uncertainty. If the Apis bull represented strength, fertility, and order, then the lioness of Sekhmet represented something far more dangerous. Sekhmet was one of the most feared goddesses of ancient Egypt, and her sacred animal, the lioness, carried both awe and terror. She was the goddess of plague and war, but also of healing and protection. To honor her was to admit that destruction and cure came from the same divine source. The lioness in Egypt was not a distant symbol, Lions roamed the deserts at the edges of the Nile Valley, and their presence reminded Egyptians of the untamed power beyond their cultivated fields. A lioness protecting her cubs, swift and deadly, was the perfect reflection of Sekhmet's nature. She could guard, but she could also devastate. In myths, Sekhmet was called the Eye of Ra, sent out to punish humanity when it strayed from divine order. Her fury was so great that the gods had to trick her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood, lulling her into sleep and ending her rampage. Because of this dual nature, the cult of Sekhmet was complex. On one hand, she was worshipped as a bringer of plague and destruction. Temples offered her sacrifices to keep her anger at bay, hoping to prevent epidemics or disaster. On the other hand, she was also invoked in healing rituals. Egyptian doctors, many of whom were also priests, prayed to Sekhmet to turn her destructive energy into medicine. Her name was inscribed on protective amulets worn by soldiers and healers alike. In this way, the lioness stood at the crossroads of life and death, fear and hope. The cult of Sekhmet was especially strong during times of crisis. Pharaohs often turned to her in war, believing that her ferocity would march with their armies. Inscriptions describe kings as beloved of Sekhmet, claiming that her burning breath destroyed enemies on the battlefield. Yet the same kings also prayed to her for protection from disease, showing how closely the ideas of violence and healing were linked. To control destruction was to command renewal, and Sekhmet embodied that dangerous balance. Temples dedicated to Sekhmet dotted Egypt, with one of the most significant centers at Memphis. Statues of the goddess often show her with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk, a clear reminder of her role as the fiery eye of the sun god. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these statues, suggesting that her cult was not only widespread but deeply institutionalized. Priests may have performed daily rituals to soothe her temper, offering food, drink, and chants designed to keep her destructive side under control. Sekhmet's influence also touched daily life. Ordinary Egyptians wore amulets shaped like lionesses or inscribed with her name to ward off illness. In magical texts, her power was invoked in spells against fever and disease. The people feared her, but they also depended on her. In their worldview, the forces that cause sickness were the same forces that could grant recovery. Sekhmet embodied that truth, and her lioness form made it visible to all. The cult of the lioness also reveals something essential about Egyptian thought, the belief that balance came not from denying danger but from honoring it. To us, it might seem strange to pray to a goddess of plague for healing, but to the Egyptians, this was logical. If the divine could bring disease, only the divine could remove it. To ignore Sekhmet was to risk her wrath. To honor her was to invite her protection. The lioness was the embodiment of this paradox, terrifying yet protective, destructive yet healing. Even today, when we look at the statues of Sekhmet, carved in dark stone with her fierce eyes and sharp features, we feel a trace of the fear and respect she commanded. She was not a gentle figure, but a reminder of life's harsh truths. Survival depended not on avoiding danger, but on respecting its power. The Egyptians recognized this, and in their devotion to Sekhmet, they created a cult that was both fearful and hopeful, destructive and healing, deadly and divine. In the end, the lioness of Sekhmet shows us how Egyptians embraced the contradictions of existence. Life was never safe, but by honoring the forces of destruction, they believed they could transform them into protection. Sekhmet's roar was the roar of life itself, fierce and untamed, demanding respect and reverence. If the lioness of Sekhmet embodied ferocity and destruction, the Ibis of Thoth represented calm, precision, and wisdom. The sight of this elegant bird wading through the shallows of the Nile, its long curved beak dipping into the water, must have seemed to Egyptians like a natural symbol of order and thought. To them, Thoth was the god of writing, knowledge, time, and balance. His ibis was not a random choice, but the perfect mirror of these qualities. The ibis moves carefully, each step measured, each motion deliberate. Its curved beak probes with patience and accuracy. To Egyptians, this was the very image of thought itself, cautious, methodical, and exact. Just as the ibis searched for food in the river mud, so Thoth searched for truth in the mysteries of the universe. This image shaped an entire cult around the bird, one that grew especially strong in Hermopolis, the city dedicated to Thoth. Thoth was more than a god of learning. He was the divine scribe who recorded the words of the gods and the deeds of men. In myths, he was present at the weighing of the heart in the afterlife, writing down the judgment that determined a soul's fate. He was also credited with inventing writing itself, giving humanity the gift of recording speech in symbols. In this way, he was the bridge between thought and expression, between the divine order and human society. The ibis, graceful and precise, became his living emblem. The cult of the ibis was both spiritual and practical. Temples bred thousands of these birds, raising them specifically for mummification as offerings to Thoth. Archaeologists have uncovered vast catacombs filled with millions of ibis mummies, each one a small prayer wrapped in linen and sealed in jars. Pilgrims who came to Hermopolis purchased these mummies as acts of devotion, believing that by offering an ibis to Thoth, they could secure his wisdom or his favor in the afterlife. What is striking about the ibis cult is its scale. The sheer number of mummified birds points to a massive economy behind the practice. Farmers and hunters captured ibises, temple workers bred them, and embalmers prepared them in endless numbers. The devotion to Thoth was not a small or symbolic gesture. It was an industry that shaped local economies and supported entire communities. In this, we see again how animal cults acted as civic pillars. The ibis also shaped the daily lives of Egyptians through education and ritual. Students learning to write often prayed to Thoth for guidance. Scribes, who held important positions in administration, law, and religion, wore amulets of the ibis or inscribed his name on their tools. To them, Thoth was not an abstract god but a daily presence, a protector of their craft. The bird that walked quietly along the riverbank was a reminder that wisdom required patience and observation. Thoth's connection to the moon added another layer of meaning. The moon, with its cycles of waxing and waning, symbolized time and order. The ibis, often active at dusk, was seen as linked to this celestial rhythm. Through Thoth, the Egyptians connected the precision of writing and calculation with the grand cycles of the cosmos. In their worldview, the same order that guided the ibis's steps guided the universe itself. The cult of the ibis also carried a moral dimension. Wisdom was not just knowledge but balance. Thoth was the mediator between gods, the one who settled disputes and restored harmony. In this role, he embodied the Egyptian ideal of Ma'at, the principle of truth and order that underpinned the entire cosmos. The ibis, careful and deliberate, reminded Egyptians that wisdom was not loud or violent but quiet, patient, and balanced. Even today, the ibis mummies stored in museums speak to this devotion. Each small bird, wrapped and preserved, represents a prayer for order in a world of uncertainty. Each curved beak points to the belief that truth is discovered through careful searching. The cult of the ibis shows us that Egyptians did not only fear the divine, they sought wisdom from it, and they found that wisdom mirrored in the graceful form of a bird. In the end, the ibis of Thoth was more than a sacred animal. It was a symbol of humanity's search for meaning, of the connection between thought and creation, of the quiet power of order over chaos. The Egyptians recognized this, and in their devotion to the Ibis, they built a cult that reflected the deepest values of their civilization: patience, balance, and wisdom. If the Ibis of Thoth reflected wisdom and patience, then the cat of Bastet reflected intimacy, protection, and grace. No animal was closer to the Egyptian home than the cat, and no cult spread more widely among ordinary people. To understand the Egyptians, we must understand their devotion to Bastet, the feline goddess who guarded households and embodied both tenderness and power. The cat in Egypt was more than a pet, it was a protector. Cats hunted snakes and rodents, creatures that threatened food supplies and family safety. To see a cat strike down a cobra was to see life itself defended against chaos. This natural role made the cat a symbol of Bastet, the goddess of the home, fertility, and motherhood. She was often pictured as a woman with the head of a cat, or as a sleek feline, graceful but alert, gentle but dangerous when provoked. The cult of Bastet reached its height in the city of Bubastis, in the Nile Delta. Ancient writers described her festivals as some of the largest and most joyful in Egypt. Boats full of singing, dancing pilgrims traveled down the river to celebrate the goddess. Markets swelled with trade, music filled the streets, and temples overflowed with offerings. Her worship was not solemn and fearful like that of Sekhmet. It was celebratory, filled with life, family, and laughter. Bastet represented the warmth of the hearth and the bond of community, and her festivals mirrored that spirit. Yet, Bastet was not only about joy. She carried a protective edge. Just as a cat defends her kittens with sudden ferocity, Bastet defended the vulnerable. Women prayed to her for safe childbirth. Families prayed for protection against disease, and farmers prayed for healthy crops. In amulets, cats appeared as guardians, their alert eyes watching over the wearer. To keep a figure of Bastet in the home was to invite her presence into daily life, making the household part of the divine order. The scale of devotion to Bastet can still be seen in the enormous number of cat mummies found in Egypt. Archaeologists have uncovered entire cemeteries filled with these animals, carefully wrapped and buried as offerings. Just like the Ibis of Thoth, the cat became part of a vast religious economy. Temples bred cats in large numbers to supply the demand for votive mummies. Pilgrims purchased them as tokens of devotion, believing that by offering a cat to Bastet, they secured her favor and protection. This devotion created a unique bond between people and animals. Cats in Egypt were treated with remarkable respect. To harm or kill a cat, even by accident, was considered a serious crime, sometimes punishable by death. Foreign visitors like the Greek historian Herodotus noted how Egyptians would go into mourning when a household cat died, shaving their eyebrows as a sign of grief. This shows us how deeply the cult of Bastet penetrated not only public religion but private life. The dual nature of Bastet also reveals something important about Egyptian thought. She was gentle but fierce, nurturing but protective. In earlier times, Bastet was even seen as a counterpart to Sekhmet, two sides of the same divine force. Where Sekhmet's lioness raged with fire, Bastet's cat brought calm and affection. Yet both could protect, both could strike when needed. In this way, Bastet represented the balance of strength and softness, showing Egyptians that protection could come through love as much as through fear. In daily life, Bastet's presence was everywhere. Amulets shaped like cats hung from necklaces. Small bronze statues decorated homes. Children grew up with cats not just as companions but as reminders of divine guardianship. Even today, when we see these artifacts in museums, we sense the closeness between Egyptians and their feline protectors. The cat was not distant or exotic. It was part of the family, part of the rhythm of life, part of the sacred woven into the ordinary. In the end, the cats of Bastet reveal the heart of Egyptian devotion. They show us that religion was not only about kings and temples, but about households, mothers, children, and the everyday struggle for safety and comfort. Bastet's cat was the divine made intimate, a reminder that even the smallest creature could reflect the eternal. Religion in ancient Egypt was never only a private affair carried out in temples by priests. It was public, communal, and alive in the rhythm of festivals. Nowhere was this more visible than in the animal cults, where sacred creatures inspired grand processions, vibrant celebrations, and gatherings that united entire communities. Festivals were the moments when the divine stepped out of the temple and into the streets, when people of all classes could participate in honoring the animals that reflected their gods. One of the most famous was the festival of Bastet at Bubastis. Greek writers described how pilgrims traveled by boat down the Nile, singing and dancing as they approached the city. Music echoed from flutes and drums, laughter carried across the water, and crowds poured into the sacred precincts. Once there, offerings of food, drink, and mummified cats filled the temple, while families celebrated together. For Egyptians, this was more than entertainment. It was a renewal of the protective bond Bastet offered to every household. The joy of the festival was itself a form of worship, a reminder that divine favor was tied to community and celebration. The cult of the Ibis bull also held regular festivals. When the sacred bull appeared in public, crowds gathered to see him, treating his every movement as a message from the gods. Priests led him through the streets, adorned with flowers and ornaments, while pilgrims followed, chanting prayers. The sight of the bull was believed to bring fertility to the land, and his presence was a reassurance that the gods were near. These processions reinforced the Ibis cult's central role in binding together city and countryside, wealth and devotion. Sekhmet's rituals, by contrast, were more solemn and fearful. At certain times of the year, priests performed elaborate ceremonies to calm her fiery nature and protect Egypt from plague. Statues of the lioness-headed goddess were paraded through temples, while offerings of beer, dyed red to resemble blood, were presented to soothe her rage. These rituals reminded the people that destruction and healing were both in Sekhmet's hands, and that balance had to be maintained through constant devotion. The processions carried both awe and dread, keeping alive the belief that life itself depended on divine harmony. Festivals for Thoth and his Ibis were quieter but equally significant. Scribes and scholars gathered to honor the god of wisdom, offering mummified birds as prayers for clarity and skill. Rituals often included recitations of sacred texts, reinforcing Thoth's role as guardian of writing and time. For those who worked in administration, law, or teaching, these ceremonies provided both spiritual reassurance and professional legitimacy. To serve the state was to serve Thoth, and the Ibis was his constant reminder. What made these festivals so powerful was not only the rituals but their ability to unite people. Farmers, craftsmen, merchants, and nobles all gathered under the same banners, driven by shared devotion. The festivals were times of suspension from daily labor, moments when the sacred interrupted the ordinary. They gave structure to the year, marking cycles of fertility, harvest, and renewal. Just as the Nile's flood sustained life, so too did the rhythm of festivals sustain faith. We should also remember the sensory experience. The colors of banners, the sound of chanting, the smell of incense and roasting food, the sight of animals led through the streets, all these created an atmosphere that imprinted itself on memory. For Egyptians, religion was not abstract belief but a lived, physical reality. To see a sacred animal, to touch its image, to join a crowd in celebration was to feel the divine directly. The festivals made that possible. Even today, when we read accounts of these gatherings, we can sense their energy. They were not only about honoring gods, but about renewing social bonds. People traveled, traded, met, and celebrated together. Communities found strength in shared rituals, and temples grew wealthier through offerings. Festivals were engines of both faith and economy, blending devotion with prosperity. In the end, festivals and rituals show us how deeply animals were woven into the communal life of Egypt. They were not silent symbols hidden in temples, but living presences that inspired celebration, fear, and joy. Through festivals, Egyptians carried their devotion into the streets, binding together religion, society, and the natural world in one continuous flow. Behind the colorful festivals and the grand rituals of the animal cults stood an economic machine. Temples in ancient Egypt were not only places of prayer, they were centers of production, storage, and trade. Nowhere was this clearer than in the cults of sacred animals. To sustain millions of mummified offerings, to feed and house living vessels of the divine, and to host vast festivals required resources on a massive scale. The temples became engines of economy, turning devotion into wealth and employment for entire communities. Consider the cult of the Ibis at Hermopolis. Archaeologists have discovered underground catacombs filled with millions of bird mummies. Each of these represented an offering purchased by a pilgrim and prepared by temple workers. To support such a demand, ibises had to be bred, captured, and raised. Farmers supplied food for the birds, hunters brought them from the wild, and craftsmen made jars to hold the mummies. Embalmers applied their skills day after day, wrapping each bird in linen and sealing it carefully. The scale of this industry was extraordinary, and it all revolved around faith in Thoth. The same was true for cats at Bastet. Pilgrims purchased mummified cats as gifts to Bastet, and temples raised large numbers of kittens specifically for this purpose. Families traveling to the great festivals bought these offerings, turning their devotion into direct economic support for the temple. Local markets thrived on the trade of amulets, figurines, and statues, each one carrying the image of a cat. Artisans and merchants benefited, while farmers provided grain and livestock for temple rituals. In this way, the cult of Bastet shaped not only religion but the prosperity of an entire region. The Apis bull cult shows the economic scale in even sharper relief. Caring for a single bull chosen as the living vessel of Ptah required land, workers, and constant resources. The temple of Memphis, which housed the bull, owned large estates that provided grain and wealth to support its rituals. Pilgrims who came to see the bull paid offerings, which were then redistributed through the temple system. Embalmers, stonecutters, and laborers were employed to prepare the vast sarcophagi used for the burial of each bull. The Serapeum at Saqqara, with its massive granite tombs, was not only a sacred necropolis, but also a display of the immense financial resources drawn in by devotion. Even Sekhmet's cult, though focused on fear of plague and destruction, generated an economy of offerings. Beer dyed red to resemble blood was brewed in enormous quantities for her rituals. Priests, brewers, and farmers all contributed to this system. Each offering, each ritual drink, meant more labor, more trade, and more redistribution of resources. Fear of the goddess became a force that sustained industries, just as love for Bastet or reverence for Thoth did elsewhere. We must also remember that temples did not operate in isolation. They owned land, employed farmers, and collected taxes. In some ways, they functioned like estates or corporations, drawing wealth from across the countryside. Devotion to animals fueled this system, because each cult demanded constant supply. Linen for wrappings, oils for embalming, food for sacred animals, and materials for statues all had to be produced. This created jobs for artisans, farmers, herders, and transport workers. The temple economy was deeply woven into daily survival. For ordinary Egyptians, this system was both a burden and a blessing. On one hand, offerings required payment, and pilgrimages cost money. On the other hand, the temples provided employment, stability, and redistribution. By working for the temple or selling goods to pilgrims, villagers gained income. The cults ensured that devotion was never separate from survival. Religion and economy reinforced one another. What is striking is how sustainable this system was for centuries. As long as devotion remained strong, the temples thrived. The animals provided a visible, living focus for faith, ensuring constant streams of offerings. In turn, the wealth of the temples supported monumental building projects, large-scale burials, and the continuation of festivals. This cycle of devotion and economy kept Egyptian society stable through centuries of change. When we look back, it becomes clear that animal cults were never just about belief. They were about power, resources, and survival. The sacred animals were not only mirrors of divine qualities, they were engines of prosperity, drawing together devotion and wealth in ways that shaped the lives of millions. The temple economy shows us that the line between religion and economy did not exist in Egypt. Faith was economy, and economy was faith. The grand temples of Egypt, with their sacred animals and vast economies, were only one side of the story. The other side lived inside the homes of ordinary people. For most Egyptians, religion was not confined to festivals or pilgrimages. It was present in the daily rhythm of life, woven into the objects they touched, the symbols they wore, and the amulets they carried. Through these small and personal items, the animal cults entered every household, bringing the divine into the most intimate spaces. Amulets were among the most common expressions of devotion. Shaped from pharaohs, stone, bronze, or gold, they carried the images of sacred animals linked to specific gods. A scarab beetle, representing rebirth and the rising sun, was worn to ensure renewal and good fortune. A cat amulet, tied to Bastet, guarded the home from disease and misfortune. An ibis charm invoked the wisdom of Thoth, while a falcon symbolized the watchful protection of Horus. These small objects were not decorative, they were considered active forces, channels through which divine power could flow into human life. Amulets were worn by men, women, and children alike. Infants might be given charms to protect them from illness, while adults carried symbols to strengthen their work or ensure safe travel. Farmers prayed to Sobek, the crocodile god, for fertile fields and protection from the dangers of the Nile. Soldiers wore lion amulets linked to Sekhmet, seeking her strength in battle. The belief was not abstract. It was practical and immediate. An amulet was as essential as a tool or weapon, a piece of divine insurance against the risks of life. The influence of animal cults also appeared in household objects. Pottery, furniture, and wall paintings often carried animal motifs. Cats crouched on painted jars, falcons spread their wings on household shrines, and cobras curled around protective door frames. These images reinforce the idea that divine power was present in every corner of the home. A family might not be able to afford a trip to Memphis or Bastet, but they could still honor the sacred animals through the images and symbols that surrounded them daily. Homes also contained small domestic shrines, where families placed offerings of bread, beer, or incense. These shrines often included figures of sacred animals. A bronze cat might stand guard over the hearth, or a carved falcon might rest beside an oil lamp. In these spaces, religion blended with routine. Lighting a lamp or sharing a meal could become an act of devotion. The sacred and the ordinary were never separate. The presence of animals in art and amulets also carried social meaning. Wearing a particular charm signaled one's devotion, linking individuals to specific cults and communities. A scribe displaying an Ibis amulet showed his connection to Thoth and his profession. A mother wearing a cat charm expressed her devotion to Bastet and her hope for protection in childbirth. These symbols were not only personal but also communal, reminding people that they belonged to a wider network of belief. What is remarkable is how democratic this aspect of religion was. While great temples required wealth and power, amulets and household shrines were available to nearly everyone. Pilgrims could purchase inexpensive faience charms, ensuring that even the poor could carry divine protection. The animal cults thus reached across social classes, binding the rich and the poor in shared devotion. No matter one's station, a small scarab or cat amulet provided a direct link to the divine. This intimacy reveals another layer of Egyptian thought. The divine was not distant or unreachable. It was near, present in the smallest objects of daily life. To hold an amulet was to hold a fragment of cosmic order. To look at a painted cat on a jar was to remember Bastet's protection. To touch the image of a falcon was to invite Horus's watchful eye. The animal cults were not confined to ceremonies in grand temples. They lived in the hands and hearts of ordinary people. Even today, when we see these amulets in museums, their power is clear. They are small, yet they carry immense meaning. Each one was a statement of faith, a hope for protection, a reflection of the bond between humans, animals, and the divine. They remind us that religion in Egypt was not only about kings and priests, but about mothers, children, farmers, and workers who sought comfort and security in symbols of the sacred. In the end, amulets and household objects show us that animal cults were not distant rituals but intimate presences. They shaped the way Egyptians lived every day, turning homes into sanctuaries and objects into vessels of divine power. Through them, the sacred animals became part of daily life, protecting, guiding, and reminding Egyptians that the divine was never far away. The sacred animals of Egypt were not only part of festivals, temples, and households. They also shaped the law itself. To harm a sacred creature was not simply a crime against society. It was a crime against the divine order. For Egyptians, morality and legality were intertwined with devotion to animals. Protecting them was not optional. It was a duty, reinforced by both social pressure and state authority. Greek historians who visited Egypt were often astonished by the intensity of this devotion. They wrote of mobs rising against anyone accused of harming a sacred animal. Even if the act was accidental, the consequences could be severe. In some cases, households were attacked, and the accused could face death. The law supported such reactions because to kill a sacred cat, ibis, or other animal was to insult the gods themselves. It was more than personal guilt. It was a disturbance of cosmic balance. This principle reflected the Egyptian belief in Maat, the order that governed both the universe and human society. Maat was truth, justice, and harmony. Every action either supported it or threatened it. To protect sacred animals was to maintain Maat. To harm them was to invite chaos. In this way, law became a spiritual responsibility, and morality was enforced through both divine fear and civic structure. Temples played a role in enforcing these rules. Priests kept watch over sacred animals, ensuring their care and safety. They also presided over rituals of purification if a transgression occurred. The protection of animals was not left to chance. It was carefully supervised, part of the broader system that tied religion to governance. Kings themselves often issued decrees praising devotion to animals, reinforcing their political authority by aligning it with sacred protection. The legal status of sacred animals also influenced daily life. A family that kept a cat, for example, knew that the animal was under divine protection. If it died, even naturally, mourning was expected. People shaved their eyebrows as a sign of grief, showing both respect for the cat and submission to the divine order. These customs were not written laws in the modern sense, but they carried the same force. Social expectation, reinforced by religion, was as powerful as any decree. The reach of these laws extended beyond individuals. Communities were judged by how they treated sacred animals. Cities that housed important cults, such as Memphis with the Apis bull or Bastet with the cats of Bastet, carried heavy responsibility. Festivals and pilgrimages brought wealth, but they also demanded strict observance of animal protection. A single act of harm could tarnish the reputation of a city and bring divine displeasure. Thus, civic pride and devotion were bound together by legal and moral obligation. We must also consider how these rules shaped Egyptian values. By placing animals at the center of law and morality, Egyptians expressed a worldview that blurred the line between human and divine, natural and spiritual. Justice was not simply about human relationships. It was about relationships between humans, animals, and gods. To live justly was to live in harmony with all three. This vision gave Egyptian law a depth that we often overlook, one that made morality inseparable from the natural world. From a modern perspective, such devotion might seem extreme. To punish someone with death for killing a cat may appear excessive, yet in the Egyptian system it was logical. The cat was not only an animal, it was a vessel of Bastet, a mirror of divine protection. To harm, it was to reject the very principle of order on which society rested. Law, morality, and religion all flowed from this foundation. Even today, the strictness of these laws impresses us. They remind us that Egyptian devotion was not a matter of private belief but of public order. Faith in animals shaped not only festivals and rituals but the very rules by which people lived. It created a society where the divine was always present, where justice itself was tied to respect for sacred creatures. In the end, law and morality show us the seriousness of Egyptian devotion. Sacred animals were not symbolic decorations. They were central to the order of the world. To protect them was to protect Maat. To harm them was to invite chaos. This belief bound individuals, families, and cities into a shared moral framework, one that gave Egyptian civilization both its strength and its endurance. When most people hear the word mummy, they think of kings and queens sealed in golden tombs. Yet in ancient Egypt, mummification was not reserved for pharaohs or nobles alone. Animals were also mummified in astonishing numbers. Cats, ibises, crocodiles, rams, fish, even beetles, all were carefully wrapped in linen and preserved. To the Egyptians, animal mummification was not an odd custom or an eccentric ritual. It was a profound act of devotion, a bridge between human prayers and divine power. There were different kinds of animal mummies. Some animals were companions, preserved to accompany their owners into the afterlife. A beloved cat might be embalmed and placed in the tomb of its master, ensuring the bond continued beyond death. These cases were personal and intimate, reflecting the affection Egyptians felt for their animals. But the majority of animal mummies had a different purpose. They were offerings, created to serve as gifts to the gods. Millions of creatures were bred, sacrificed, and mummified as acts of devotion. Each one was a prayer in physical form. The process of animal mummification followed many of the same steps used for humans. The body was dried, treated with natron, wrapped in linen, and sometimes coated in resin. Embalmers displayed great skill, creating intricate wrappings that formed patterns and designs. Some mummies were even decorated with painted faces or gilded masks, transforming the animal into a sacred object of beauty. Archaeologists have discovered mummies shaped to resemble cats with painted whiskers or falcons with carefully carved wooden heads attached. These details show the care and artistry that went into the practice. The scale of this devotion is almost unimaginable. At Saqqara, vast catacombs contain millions of ibis mummies. At Bastet and other sites, entire cemeteries of cats have been uncovered. Crocodiles, some more than 15 feet long, were embalmed and placed in massive stone coffins. In one extraordinary case, a giant crocodile was found filled with dozens of tiny baby crocodiles, each one carefully preserved. These were not isolated gestures. They were part of a massive, organized system of worship that lasted for centuries. Why did Egyptians go to such lengths? The answer lies in their understanding of offerings. To present an animal mummy to a god was to make a direct connection between human and divine. The animal, as a vessel of sacred qualities, carried the prayer of the devotee into eternity. The ibis brought wisdom, the cat brought protection, the bull brought fertility, and the crocodile brought strength. By offering these creatures, Egyptians believed they were offering fragments of divine power itself. The economic impact of this practice was enormous. Temples maintained breeding grounds for animals, employing workers to care for them. Hunters and fishermen supplied wild animals, while embalmers and artisans specialized in preparing the mummies. Pilgrims purchased them at temples. Just as one might buy a candle in a modern shrine, the demand was constant and the supply vast. Faith fueled an entire industry, one that touched every level of society. The symbolic weight of animal mummification also reveals much about Egyptian thought. For them, life and death were not opposites but stages of continuity. To preserve an animal's body was to preserve the divine essence it reflected. The wrapped form became a channel of eternal power, a silent prayer sealed in linen. In this way, the practice linked the living world with the world of the gods, ensuring that devotion did not fade with time. It is easy for us today to see only the strangeness of millions of animal mummies, yet if we look closer, we see a system of belief that valued connection, continuity, and reflection. Each mummy was a bridge between human need and divine presence. Each one testified to a society that saw animals not as lesser beings but as vessels of sacred truth. In the end, animal mummification was not a curiosity of ancient religion. It was its heartbeat. Through the preservation of cats, ibises, crocodiles, and countless others, Egyptians carried their prayers into eternity. The linen wrappings, the careful embalmings, the endless catacombs all remind us that in Egypt, the bond between humans, animals, and gods was not symbolic. It was real, physical, and enduring. When we look at the endless rows of animal mummies uncovered in Egyptian catacombs, it is easy to imagine them as curiosities, strange relics of a distant past. But to the Egyptians, they were never curiosities. They were offerings, deliberate gifts to the gods, as real and as necessary as food or water. Each mummified cat, ibis, crocodile, or bull calf was a prayer wrapped in linen, a physical gesture of devotion meant to cross the boundary between human and divine. The practice of giving animals as offerings was rooted in the Egyptian belief that the gods required constant nourishment. Just as humans ate food to live, the gods drew strength from offerings. Bread, beer, incense, and flowers were part of this daily ritual. But animals carried a deeper significance. Because they were vessels of divine qualities, presenting them was like presenting the essence of the god back to itself. An ibis carried wisdom, a cat carried protection, a crocodile carried strength, and a bull carried fertility. By giving these offerings, worshippers believed they were reinforcing the cosmic order. Pilgrims traveled to temples specifically to purchase animal mummies as votive gifts. These were not rare luxuries reserved for the elite. Even modest families could buy a small mummified bird or kitten, making their devotion tangible. To leave an animal mummy in a temple was to leave a piece of one's hopes and prayers, entrusted to the priests who presented them to the gods during rituals. Over time, the sheer volume of these offerings created entire industries devoted to breeding, embalming, and selling animal. The act of offering was also personal. A family facing illness might present a cat mummy to Bastet, praying for protection and healing. A scribe seeking wisdom might offer an ibis to Thoth. A farmer hoping for fertile fields might give a young bull to Ptah or Sobek. Each offering was tied to a need, each mummy a plea for divine assistance. To us, the idea of wrapping millions of animals may seem excessive. To the Egyptians, it was logical. The gods were eternal, and devotion had to be constant. The offerings also had a communal side. Large ceremonies involved processions of sacred animals, where priests presented them on behalf of the people. When the Apis bull was displayed, the entire community joined in the devotion, interpreting his movements as signs from the gods. These rituals reinforced the idea that divine offerings were not only private prayers but public acts that bound society together. Everyone shared in the blessings, and everyone shared in the responsibility of maintaining them. We must also see the political dimension of these offerings. Pharaohs often participated in presenting sacred animals, demonstrating their role as mediators between gods and people. By making offerings of animals, kings reinforced their legitimacy, showing that they upheld Ma'at, the principle of truth and order. In doing so, they reminded the people that their reign was blessed and sanctioned by divine power. Animal offerings thus supported not only religion but also the very foundation of political authority. The archaeological evidence speaks to the scale of this devotion. At Saqqara, catacombs hold millions of ibis mummies stacked in endless jars. At Bubastis, cemeteries of cats stretch for hundreds of meters. At Crocodilopolis, entire caverns contain crocodile mummies, some accompanied by their young. Each of these represents a prayer, a family's hope, or a community's devotion. Together, they show us a society where offerings were not symbolic gestures but practical necessities of faith. Even today, when we look at these mummies, we can sense the seriousness of the practice. The careful wrappings, the decorated cases, the sheer numbers all testify to a devotion that was constant and widespread. For Egyptians, divine offerings were not optional. They were essential to the survival of both the individual and the state. To neglect them was to risk angering the gods and upsetting the balance of the world. In the end, animal offerings remind us that religion in Egypt was both deeply personal and profoundly communal. Each mummy was a prayer, a gift, a reflection of devotion. Together, they formed an unbroken chain of faith stretching across centuries. Through these offerings, Egyptians sustained their gods, sustained their society, and sustained the cosmic balance that held their world together. When archaeologists first uncovered the vast catacombs beneath the sands of Egypt, they were astonished by what they found. These were not tombs for kings or nobles, they were cemeteries for animals. Miles of tunnels lined with jars of mummified ibises, chambers stacked with the remains of cats, crocodiles preserved in stone coffins, and countless other creatures, all buried with care. These places were not hidden away as curiosities. They were monumental testaments to devotion, visible reminders of how central animals were to Egyptian faith. One of the most famous sites is Saqqara, near Memphis. There, beneath the desert plateau, lie the Serapeum and other vast burial grounds. While the Serapeum housed the massive sarcophagi of the Apis bulls, nearby catacombs contain millions of Ibis mummies. Each one represents a votive offering to Thoth, the god of wisdom. Visitors to these catacombs today see endless corridors filled with jars, row after row, stretching into the darkness. The scale alone reveals the depth of Egyptian commitment. These were not rare events. They were everyday acts of devotion multiplied over centuries. At Bubastis, the city of Bastet, archaeologists discovered cemeteries filled with cats. Some were simple bundles of linen, others were carefully shaped to resemble the animal, with painted whiskers or gilded masks. Families brought them as offerings, leaving behind not just one or two, but thousands upon thousands over generations. These cemeteries tell us that devotion to Bastet was not limited to festivals. It was continuous, woven into the daily rhythm of Egyptian life. In the Fayum region, at a site the Greeks later called Crocodilopolis, sacred crocodiles were bred and buried in great numbers. Some were embalmed whole, others with their young placed inside them, symbolizing fertility and abundance. Massive stone coffins were carved to hold their bodies, and temples were built to honor Sobek, the crocodile god. These burials remind us that even creatures feared for their danger were honored as sacred vessels, capable of carrying prayers into eternity. The cemeteries also reveal the organization behind the cults. These were not random acts of individuals. They were managed systems. Priests oversaw the breeding, embalming, and burial of animals. Artisans crafted coffins and jars, farmers provided food, and workers dug tunnels and chambers. Each cemetery was part of a vast economic and religious network, showing how devotion shaped both faith and labor. For ordinary Egyptians, visiting these cemeteries was likely a powerful experience. To descend into the cool darkness of a catacomb filled with sacred animals was to enter a space between worlds. Each mummy represented a prayer already carried to the gods. To add one's own offering was to join a chorus of devotion stretching back centuries. The presence of so many sacred animals reinforced the feeling that the divine was close, listening, and eternal. From a modern perspective, the sheer numbers can feel overwhelming. Millions of ibises, cats, and other animals, all preserved and buried. Some scholars once dismissed these cemeteries as evidence of superstition gone too far. Yet, when we look more closely, we see something deeper. These cemeteries were physical archives of faith, each animal a record of devotion, each burial a reminder of the link between human and divine. They were not wasteful excess, but expressions of continuity, ensuring that prayers never ceased. The cemeteries also reflect the Egyptian view of death. Just as humans were preserved to journey into the afterlife, so too were animals preserved to carry prayers and accompany souls. Death was not an end but a passage, and cemeteries of animals stood as bridges between this world and the next. They were places of memory, continuity, and sacred presence. Even today, when we walk through the remains of these burial grounds, we feel their weight. The quiet rows of jars, the careful wrappings, the scale of the devotion all remind us that to the Egyptians, animals were not lesser beings. They were partners in the sacred, vessels of divine power, and companions in the journey beyond death. In the end, the animal cemeteries of Egypt show us a civilization where devotion was measured not only in words or rituals, but in bodies carefully preserved, buried, and honored. They are enduring monuments to a faith that bound together humans, animals, and gods in an unbroken chain of reverence. For the Egyptians, death was not an end. It was a passage into the Duat, the mysterious realm of the afterlife. Just as humans were preserved through mummification and guided by spells from the Book of the Dead, animals too played a role in this journey. Sacred creatures were not simply buried and forgotten. They were companions, guides, and symbols, helping souls cross from the world of the living to the eternal fields beyond. The duat was imagined as a landscape filled with rivers, gates, and challenges. The soul of the deceased had to navigate this realm, defended by spells, guarded by amulets, and judged by the gods. Animals appeared at every stage. Jackals, falcons, cats, and crocodiles all had roles in the mythology of the afterlife. To the Egyptians, these were not coincidences. They believed the same creatures they honored in life also shaped the path of the soul after death. Anubis, the jackal-headed god, guided the dead through the weighing of the heart. The falcon of Horus symbolized the soul's rise toward the heavens. The scarab beetle pushed the sun across the sky, a reminder of rebirth and continuity. Cats and lions, linked to Bastet and Sekhmet, guarded against evil spirits, while crocodiles reminded the soul of the dangers that lurked in both life and death. Each animal was a reflection of divine power, present in the trials of the afterlife. Animal mummies themselves became part of this process. Families placed them in tombs as offerings, ensuring that the deceased had divine companions. A cat might guard the tomb against evil. An ibis might offer wisdom during judgment. A bull might symbolize fertility, ensuring the soul's renewal in the fields of paradise. These offerings were not sentimental gestures. They were practical steps, designed to strengthen the soul's chances of survival in the duat. The role of animals in funerary belief also extended to the great cemeteries. By burying millions of sacred creatures, Egyptians ensured that a constant stream of offerings flowed into the afterlife. Each mummy was a messenger, carrying prayers into eternity. In this way, the dead were never alone. They traveled in the company of divine animals, surrounded by reflections of the gods. The cemeteries themselves became spiritual reservoirs, places where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. This connection between animals and the afterlife also reinforced the Egyptian vision of balance. Just as Ma'at governed the living world, it also governed the duat. The presence of animals reminded the soul that divine order was everywhere. To face judgment was to face the truth mirrored in sacred creatures. A heart heavy with lies might be devoured by Amit, the fearsome beast with the body of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, and the jaws of a crocodile. This terrifying composite creature symbolized the ultimate punishment. Even here, animals defined the limits of justice and the boundaries of eternity. What is striking is how natural this seemed to Egyptians. To them, animals were not separate from humanity. They were part of the same cosmic system. Just as a person needed companions, guides, and protectors in life, so too did the soul need them in death. The cat, the falcon, the jackal, and the crocodile were not merely earthly beings. They were eternal presences, reflections of divine order that accompanied humanity beyond the grave. For us today, this may feel symbolic, but to the Egyptians it was real. The afterlife was not abstract but tangible, and animals were as essential there as they were on earth. Their presence gave continuity to the soul's journey, bridging the gap between mortality and eternity. In the end, the role of animals in the journey to the duat shows us the depth of Egyptian devotion. They did not honor creatures only in life, but carried them into death, weaving them into the very fabric of eternity. To the Egyptians, salvation was not a solitary path. It was a shared journey, where humans and animals together crossed into the endless fields of the afterlife, guided by the divine order that bound them all. When Egypt fell under foreign rule, first to the Persians, then to the Greeks, and later to the Romans and Byzantines, many aspects of its culture began to change. Yet the devotion to animals did not vanish overnight. In fact, the sacred cults of cats, ibises, bulls, and crocodiles proved remarkably resilient. They adapted to new rulers, new languages, and even new religions, showing how deeply they were woven into Egyptian life. The Romans, in particular, were both fascinated and unsettled by Egyptian animal cults. Writers from Rome often described them with a mixture of wonder and mockery. They could not understand how a great civilization would lavish such care on cats or crocodiles. Yet, despite their skepticism, the Romans quickly realized that these cults carried immense power among the Egyptian people. To rule Egypt successfully, they had to respect its devotions. Governors attended festivals, emperors sponsored temple repairs, and Roman coins were minted with images of Egyptian gods, including those tied to animals. The Apis bull remained a central focus. At Memphis, the Serapeum continued to receive new burials for sacred bulls well into the Roman period. But the cult also evolved. Greek and Roman influences merged with Egyptian tradition, creating the figure of Serapis, a new composite god who blended the power of the Apis bull with Hellenistic traits. Serapis was depicted as a bearded man rather than an animal, but his origins remained tied to the bull of Memphis. This transformation shows how adaptable Egyptian religion was, reshaping itself to survive under foreign eyes while keeping its sacred heart alive. Bastet's cult also endured, though with changes. Festivals at Bubastis continued to draw crowds, but Roman officials sometimes restricted them, fearing that large gatherings could spark unrest. Still, devotion to cats persisted in homes and households. Cat mummies from the Roman era prove that families continued to honor Bastet, even if her temples lost some of their former glory. In this way, the feline goddess shifted from a civic power to a more private protector, surviving in the intimacy of households long after official support declined. Thoth's Ibis also remained significant. Hermopolis continued to be a center of his worship, and the production of Ibis mummies continued into the Roman age. Roman administrators relied heavily on Egyptian scribes, whose devotion to Thoth reinforced their professional identity. In some cases, Roman writers even compared Thoth to Mercury, the Roman god of communication and messages. This blending of traditions helped sustain the cult of the Ibis well into late antiquity. Sobek, the crocodile god, also adapted under Roman rule. In the Fayum, temples dedicated to Sobek remained active, and crocodile mummies continued to be buried. Roman settlers were both horrified and fascinated by the practice. Some even participated, recognizing that aligning with local devotion was a way to win favor. Here again, we see how animal cults proved flexible, adjusting to new political realities without losing their core meaning. When Christianity spread through Egypt during the Byzantine era, the animal cults faced greater pressure. Christian leaders denounced them as pagan practices, and many temples were closed. Yet traces of devotion lingered. Cat mummies, ibis burials, and crocodile remains from this period show that people continued their offerings, often in secret. Old habits survived alongside new faiths, sometimes blending into folk traditions that endured for centuries. The persistence of animal cults under foreign rule reveals their true strength. They were not fragile superstitions that collapsed under pressure. They were deeply rooted systems of meaning that connected people to the divine in ways no foreign power could erase. Even as political rulers changed, the sacred bond between Egyptians and their animals endured. From a modern perspective, this adaptability is remarkable. It shows that devotion was not rigid but alive, capable of reshaping itself while remaining true to its essence. The bull became Serapis. The ibis was compared to Mercury. The cat shifted from temple to household, and the crocodile survived even under Roman skepticism. Each transformation preserved the link between animals and the divine, ensuring that the cults continued to breathe long after empires rose and fell. In the end, the the Roman and Byzantine periods remind us that Egyptian devotion was more than ritual, it was identity. To honor animals was to be Egyptian no matter who ruled the land, and so the sacred creatures of the Nile continued their journey through history, adapting, enduring, and reminding us that the bond between humans and animals can outlast even the greatest empires. The animal cults of Egypt endured for thousands of years, surviving dynasties, foreign invasions, and cultural shifts. Yet no tradition lasts forever. With the rise of Christianity in the 4th century of our era, the old beliefs began to fade. Temples once filled with sacred animals grew quiet. Cemeteries that had received millions of offerings were sealed. The sounds of festivals and processions were replaced by new hymns, new prayers, and a very different vision of the divine. The decline of the animal cults was not sudden, but it was steady, and by the time of the Byzantine period, their power had largely passed into memory. Christian leaders saw the animal cults as dangerous remnants of paganism. They preached against the worship of creatures, condemning the idea that divine power could be reflected in animals. Bishops and monks destroyed temples or converted them into churches. Rituals once carried out in honor of cats, ibises, or crocodiles were outlawed. In official records, the old cults were treated as superstition, practices to be erased rather than preserved. Yet devotion does not vanish easily, and for many Egyptians, the old habits lingered beneath the surface. Archaeological evidence shows that animal mummification continued even as Christianity spread. Families still brought cats and ibises to be embalmed, though often in smaller numbers. In some cases, these acts may have been carried out in secret, hidden from authorities. Old beliefs blended with new ones, creating quiet continuities that lived on long after official suppression. Even when temples fell silent, households may have still whispered prayers to Bastet for protection or invoked Thoth for wisdom in their work. The decline of animal cults also reveals something about the resilience of memory. Though the rituals faded, the stories remained. Greek and Roman writers preserved accounts of Egyptian festivals, often mocking them but ensuring they were not forgotten. Travelers carried tales of cat cemeteries and crocodile shrines across the Mediterranean. Later generations, curious about the wonders of Egypt, retold these stories, keeping alive the memory of animal devotion even when the practice itself had ended. For Egyptians themselves, the loss was more complex. On one hand, the new faith brought new forms of community, new structures of belief, and new promises of salvation. On the other, it meant letting go of traditions that had defined identity for centuries. To abandon the sacred cat, the ibis, or the bull was to sever ties with ancestors who had seen those creatures as bridges to the divine. The tension between old and new must have been painful, as families chose between continuity and conversion. Yet, even in decline, the animal cults left traces that could not be erased. The cemeteries remained beneath the earth, waiting for discovery. The amulets and statues continued to circulate, passed down as heirlooms or curiosities. The language of animals survived in Christian Egypt in subtler ways, with lions, lambs, and doves taking on new symbolic roles. The memory of sacred animals found new homes in different contexts, showing that while the cults themselves faded, their influence endured. From a broader perspective, the decline of the animal cults reminds us of the fragility of religious systems. What once seemed eternal can pass into silence. Temples that thrived for 1,000 years can vanish in a single generation. Yet it also reminds us of the endurance of memory. Even when practices end, the stories, artifacts, and impressions they leave behind continue to shape cultures for centuries. Today, when we look at the animal mummies displayed in museums or walk through the ruins of Bastet and Saqqara, we are witnessing echoes of a vanished devotion. The animals no longer carry prayers to the gods, but they carry meaning for us, revealing how humans once lived in constant relationship with the natural and the divine. The cults have declined, but their memory still speaks. In the end, the decline and memory of the animal cults show us that traditions can die, but the questions they raise never vanish. Why did people devote themselves so deeply to animals? What did they see in cats, crocodiles, bulls, and ibises that we struggle to see today? The answers may belong to the past, but the memory continues to remind us that the bond between humans and animals has always been sacred, fragile, and enduring. At first glance, the animal cults of ancient Egypt may seem distant, a strange chapter of history that has little to do with our own world. After all, we no longer mummify cats by the millions or breed sacred ibises for offerings. Yet when we look more closely, the parallels between ancient devotion and modern life are striking. The ways in which Egyptians honored animals reflect patterns of thought and behavior that are still present today, though expressed in different forms. Consider the place of animals in our own societies. Many cultures continue to treat certain creatures as symbols of national identity. The bald eagle in the United States, the lion in Britain, the dragon in China, these are not casual choices. They embody qualities such as strength, courage, or wisdom, much as the falcon of Horus or the bull of Apis once did. To harm such animals, even symbolically, is often seen as an attack on the nation itself. In this sense, the Egyptian belief that animals carried divine power is not so far removed from our own belief that animals can embody collective ideals. We also see parallels in the way animals shape religion and spirituality today. In Christianity, the lamb is a central symbol of innocence and sacrifice. In Hinduism, the cow is sacred, honored as a source of nourishment and life. In Buddhism, compassion for all living creatures remains a guiding principle. These examples show that animals still serve as vessels of spiritual meaning, much as they did in ancient Egypt. The forms have changed, but the underlying impulse to see the divine reflected in the natural world remains. Even outside of religion, animals occupy roles that echo Egyptian practices. Pets are often treated as family members, their deaths mourned with rituals and remembrance. Zoos, wildlife sanctuaries, and conservation programs reveal our desire to protect certain species, sometimes elevating them above others. The language we use also shows continuity. We speak of loyal as a dog, wise as an owl, or strong as a lion, attaching symbolic meaning to animals just as Egyptians once did. The mirror of divine qualities has not disappeared. It has simply shifted into cultural habits and everyday speech. The Egyptian practice of animal offerings also has echoes in our world. We may not wrap animals in linen and place them in catacombs, but we still make symbolic offerings. People light candles, release doves at ceremonies, or place flowers on graves. Each of these acts, like the offering of an animal mummy, represents a tangible prayer, a gift meant to cross the boundary between human and divine. The form is different, but the logic that devotion requires action is the same. There is also a modern economic parallel. The temple economies of Egypt, built on breeding and embalming animals, may seem alien. Yet today, entire industries thrive on symbolic devotion. From religious merchandise to conservation tourism, faith and economy are still intertwined. Pilgrimages bring income to cities, just as they once did to Bastet or Hermopolis. Offerings, donations, and religious purchases continue to sustain communities, proving that devotion and economy remain closely linked. The Egyptian reverence for animals also speaks to our modern environmental concerns. They saw animals as vessels of divine power, inseparable from the cosmic order. Today, as we face ecological crises, many people are rediscovering a similar truth, that our survival depends on respecting the natural world. Conservation movements often frame animals not only as species to protect, but as symbols of balance, beauty, and responsibility. In honoring them, we echo the Egyptian belief that animals are more than creatures. They are reminders of our connection to something greater. These parallels remind us that the Egyptians were not strange or irrational in their devotion. They were expressing a universal human impulse to seek meaning in the world around us, to find reflections of the sacred in creatures that share our earth. We may no longer call cats the daughters of Bastet or bulls the vessels of Ptah, but we still see in animals qualities that inspire reverence, affection, and awe. In the end, the modern parallels show us that the Egyptian animal cults are not as distant as they appear. They speak to something timeless in human nature. We have always looked to animals to teach us, protect us, and reflect the divine. The forms may change, but the bond remains. And in that bond we find not only a connection to the past, but a mirror of ourselves. As we come to the end of this journey through the animal cults of ancient Egypt, it is worth pausing to reflect on what they truly reveal. At first sight, the mummified cats, the ibis-filled catacombs, or the giant sarcophagi of sacred bulls may seem like strange relics of superstition. Yet when we look deeper, we find not eccentricity but coherence, not confusion but clarity. The Egyptians lived in a world where the divine was not hidden in distant heavens. It was present in the river, the desert, the sun, and above all in the animals that shared their lives. The devotion to cats, crocodiles, ibises, bulls, and lions was not a sideshow to Egyptian civilization. It was its foundation. These creatures were mirrors of the divine order, reminders that strength, wisdom, fertility, and protection were not abstract ideas but living realities. By honoring them, Egyptians affirmed their bond with the cosmos, binding daily life to eternal truth. To wear an amulet, to join a festival, to bury an animal mummy, each of these acts reinforced the conviction that humans and animals were part of the same sacred web. The animal cults also show us the remarkable adaptability of Egyptian faith. For over 3,000 years, devotion to animals survived invasions, dynasties, and even foreign empires. It shifted, transformed, and endured because it was deeply woven into every level of life. Kings used it to legitimize their power, priests used it to sustain temples, families used it to protect their homes, and farmers used it to ensure fertile fields. In every sphere, animals carried the burden of devotion, turning belief into action and ritual into order. Their decline does not erase their meaning. Even when Christianity and later Islam swept across Egypt, the memory of sacred animals lingered in stories, artifacts, and traditions. Today, when we look at the endless rows of animal mummies in museums or walk through the ruins of Bubastis and Saqqara, we are not only seeing the past, we are witnessing the traces of a worldview that placed animals at the very center of human existence. These remains are not curiosities. They are echoes of a civilization that understood the bond between humanity and the natural world in ways we are only beginning to appreciate again. For modern readers, the lesson is simple yet profound. The Egyptians remind us that animals are not separate from us. They are companions, teachers, and mirrors of values we often forget. They show us strength in bulls, wisdom in ibises, protection in cats, and both danger and renewal in crocodiles. To them, animals were not lesser beings, they were vessels of truth, and by recognizing this, Egyptians built a civilization that endured for millennia. Perhaps the greatest reflection lies in the idea of balance. The Egyptians knew that life was fragile, that destruction and creation were bound together. By honoring animals, they honored this truth. They did not worship weakness or fear. They worshipped the balance of forces, the harmony that allowed life to endure. In this balance, animals played a central role, embodying both the gifts and the dangers of the divine. In the end, the truth about Egypt's animal cults is not that they were strange or irrational. It is that they were profoundly human. They speak to the same impulse that leads us today to place animals on flags, in myths, and in our homes. They remind us that we still look to creatures for meaning, comfort, and connection. The Egyptians carried this impulse further than most, creating temples, cemeteries, and rituals of breathtaking scale. But the heart of their devotion is something we still share. The recognition that in the eyes of an animal, we see a reflection of something greater than ourselves. So as we leave the deserts, temples, and catacombs of ancient Egypt behind, let us carry this reflection with us. The animal cults are not only a story of the past, they are a reminder of the timeless bond between humanity, divinity, and the natural world, a bond as fragile as it is eternal, as strange as it is familiar, as old as life itself. You have now walked through a side of ancient Egypt that few people imagine. Beyond pyramids and golden tombs, there were temples filled with cats, riverside shrines to crocodiles, and underground cemeteries of ibises and bulls. These were not curiosities but reflections of how Egyptians understood life itself, fragile, sacred, and bound to the natural world. What their animal cults reveal is not eccentricity but depth. Every cat, every falcon, every scarab carried meaning. To honor them was to honor balance, fertility, protection, and wisdom. By weaving animals into their faith, Egyptians created a vision of the world where nothing was ordinary. Every creature mirrored divine power. Every act of devotion reinforced the harmony of the cosmos. Today, we no longer mummify millions of animals, yet we still turn to them for meaning. We see them on flags, in myths, and in our homes. The bond is unchanged. The Egyptians remind us that to live well is to live with respect for the creatures that share our world, for in their eyes we still glimpse something greater than ourselves. This has been Boring Boris, History for Sleep, read calmly by Boris. Rest well, and let the echoes of Egypt carry you into quiet dreams.